Welcome. Thank you for attending today's event featuring Bill Jacobson. I'm Jenna Robinson, president of the James G. Martin Center for Academic Renewal. I also want to thank you all for reading our work, coming to our events, and sharing our message. You help us every day to advocate responsible governance, viewpoint diversity, academic quality, cost-effective education solutions, and innovative market-based reform. We couldn't do this without you. George Leaf will introduce our speaker in just a moment, but first I want to tell you about two recent Martin Center projects. Many of you will have seen these projects before, but they're especially relevant today to today's topic of CRT, so I will mention them again. The first is a report we released earlier this year, Critical Social Justice in the UNC System, by Scott Yenner and Anna Miller. The report explains how DEI is critical social justice in practice and details the different policies and programs devoted to DEI at all 16 UNC System schools. And it also includes total spending on staffs and salaries in DEI. The second item is a piece of model legislation that we released yesterday in conjunction with the Goldwater Institute and Stanley Kurtz of the Ethics in Public Policy Center. It's called the End Political Litmus Tests in Education Act. The bill would prohibit universities from requiring job candidates to submit diversity statements. In case you haven't heard about diversity statements or DEI statements, I'll explain briefly. These statements are personal essays about candidates' past experiences with DEI and how they will contribute to the university's DEI mission if they're hired. They are de facto political litmus tests used to enforce the campus orthodoxy and screen out viewpoint diversity. If you want either of these statements, you can find them linked in the description box. I also want to express my gratitude that the Martin Center is not alone in the fight against critical race theory. I know most of you here share our concerns about academic freedom, free speech, meritocracy, individualism, objectivity, and excellence, and how critical race theory undermines all of these things. I also want to thank our allies who are helping us push back against CRT, our friends from the John Locke Foundation, reporters from the Carolina Journal and the North State Journal, members of the North Carolina legislature, and those who are running for office, and citizen activists here in our audience. Thank you for all your work. We are in this together. I hope we can learn from each other and find ways to network and collaborate in order to make the most of the work we are all doing to restore merit and excellence as the lodestars of North Carolina education. And with that, I will hand it over to George Leaf.
Hello, I'm George Leaf, Director of Research for the James G. Martin Center, and it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Bill Jacobson. Now, Martin Center readers with good memories may recall that Bill has written for us twice in the last 2 years. Both articles were on the very topic he's going to be discussing today, which is to say critical race theory and its terrible impact on American education. Now, Bill was educated at Hamilton College in upstate New York and then Harvard Law School, where he earned his JD in 1984. Now, after he earned his law degree, Bill practiced law in New York City and then Providence, Rhode Island. In 2007, Bill joined the academic ranks as a professor of law at Cornell University, where he directs the school's securities law clinic. Now, sensing the need to battle the forces of leftism in 2008, he began a website entitled Legal Insurrection. Now, that is part of my daily reading, and I recommend it to everyone. Bill is also president of a spinoff from Legal Insurrection called the Legal Insurrection Foundation, which he founded in 2019. And of that, he writes, "We will not be a passive research entity issuing reports no one reads, but an entity that uses research, investigation, and education to create an impact on the public discourse." And then in 2021, he launched criticalracetheory.org to focus specifically on the incursion CRT is making into our education system at all levels. Now, it won't surprise you to hear that Bill has been the target of woke forces at Cornell because he dared to criticize the Black Lives Movement. But they didn't get Bill, and he's still very much on the faculty. And so I'm sure you'll enjoy his talk today. Please welcome Bill Jacobson. Thank you.
Thank you to Jenna and to George for having me. It was, I would have preferred to be there in person, but the flights got canceled last night. They said the weather, and then I read in the paper this morning or online this morning that Southwest 1,000 pilots, while they're not sicking out, they are protesting work conditions. So I think maybe that had something to do with it. I don't know. But anyway, I'm glad we're able to work out the best we can, a Zoom link, so I can give you my thoughts on the critical race theory controversy that has been raging for quite some time. The title of this lecture, as advertised by the Martin Center, which by the way does fabulous work, so I'm really glad to speak for them or speak at one of their gatherings, is "The Fight Against Critical Race Theory is a Fight for National Survival." And that might sound dramatic, but it is dramatic, but it's also true. And I'm going to talk to you for 20, 30 minutes, and then we'll have question and answer. And I'm going to approach it from my own personal experience, but I want to start kind of at the end so you'll understand what I'm talking about when I say it's a fight for national survival. And I'm going to start with somebody we highlighted on my website on Legal Insurrection. One of the things we do is we bring parents, moms, dads, teachers, other people from the community forward to tell their stories. Sometimes we get a lot of national publicity for those stories. Sometimes we don't, but they're all worth telling. And one of the people we brought forward about a year ago, maybe almost to the day, was a teacher in middle school in Providence, Rhode Island. We are based in Rhode Island, Legal Insurrection is. And her name was Ramona Bessinger. And she was a middle school teacher. And she'd been in the system for over a dozen years, a teacher for 20 years, teaching English language arts. I guess when I was growing up, they just called it English. Now it's English language arts. And she was doing quite well there. And she described in what she wrote for us and her subsequent many national media appearances, how things changed, that the school system, which is almost 100% non-white, it's almost 100% minority in Providence, Rhode Island, that school. One day they just came in and they switched the curriculum and they switched the books. They literally came in, grabbed books off the shelf and substituted them with new books from a new book company. And the theme in all of these books, if you took any one of the books individually, it wasn't so bad. But the theme in every single book and the theme of the curriculum changed, and everything became a racialized oppressor versus oppressed narrative. And the oppressor were whites and the oppressed were non-whites. And it was a theme throughout the curriculum and throughout particularly the books that were used. And she described how her good relationship with the students changed over that year and how the students began to turn on her. She is white, and turn on her to the extent that they started calling her America. That was what they would call her. You're America because you're white. We're not America because we're not white. And that really struck her profoundly. She began to object to it, and then she became something of a whistleblower. But that's what I'm talking about when it's a fight for national survival, that these themes that are being pursued, again, no one individual lesson might be bad, no one individual book, but it's setting people against each other based on race and based on skin color. It's setting students against each other, students against teachers. It is setting students against their country. In Providence, Rhode Island, believe it or not, in Rhode Island, it is mandatory that the Pledge of Allegiance be recited at the start of every school day. They don't require that any one person recite it, but as a school activity, it is recited. And she described how over the course of this year, the students not only started referring to her as America, they started refusing to stand for the Pledge of Allegiance or to say the Pledge of Allegiance. So that's what I'm talking about. This has profound impacts. And these are young students, these are middle school students, but it's what you're seeing throughout the system. And that's why I say it's a fight for national survival, because what's going on in our school systems in K through 12, in higher education, in medical schools, in law schools, in professional schools, is setting people out against each other. And that's why I think it's a fight for national survival. If you wanted to rip this country apart, what would you do differently than what they are doing? And so that's the end. That's how we get to the end of why I think it's a fight for national survival. What happened, I'm going to give my personal experiences, what I think nowadays is called my lived experience. And my lived experience is that this is not something that happened overnight. This has really been at least one, probably 2 to 3 generations in the making. It's a lot of things are intertwined, including the radicalization of faculty and administrators at the college level, the higher ed level. So in my own lived experience, I started at Hamilton College in 1977. It was a fairly conservative all-male school. Across the street, literally, there was a girls' school, Kirkland College, which was kind of a 1960s new sort of more liberal educational process. And Kirkland essentially went out of business in Hamilton my sophomore year, went co-ed. And if you trace the history of the faculty there, 30 years later, 20 years later, the Kirkland faculty, the radical faculty had taken over the faculty. They refused to hire people who were conservative. They refused to allow the study of Western civilization so bad that some of the older professors started something called the Alexander Hamilton Institute for the Study of Western Civilization, because that was a core subject at Hamilton, and it was driven out of the curriculum, not in 1 year and not in 1 decade, but over 2 to 3 decades, it was driven out of the curriculum. And the Hamilton faculty became indistinguishable from the faculty of Oberlin College or Wesleyan or any other college. I also had my lived experience at Harvard Law School. At Harvard Law School, I started in 1981. And that was really when something called critical legal studies was beginning. And it started at Harvard Law School in the late 70s, so a little bit before I got there. But it was really coming forward in the very early 80s. We used to call them the crits. That's what people referred to them as. I didn't pay a lot of attention to it. I had other interests, but critical legal studies was becoming very strong. And there were faculty members and there were students. And one of the things that I began to notice in this, again, the early 80s, I graduated in 1984, is the identification by ethnic and racial groups as opposed to individuals. So in law school, at least back then, you studied mostly individual rights and individual liberties. And everything began to become reframed, not again in 1 year, but over time, as groups based on groups, race, and ethnicity. It was what now would be called probably intersectionality, the focus on group rights and group results as opposed to individual. Now, one of the things I noticed was that most students went into business and most students went into law and had careers in whatever they did. But the most radical, the most activist students, I noticed, went into academia. And I didn't really pick that up at the time. It wasn't until 30 years later I realized. So whereas the more moderate students went into business and law, the most radical, the critical legal theory students went into academia. And they began to develop over 30 years while the rest of us were asleep at the wheel. They began to develop theories that now have resulted in critical race theory. And in fact, one of those students who was a classmate who went into academia and has spent her entire career in academia is Kimberly Crenshaw, the person who invented the concept of intersectionality and is generally credited with coining the term critical race theory, although that wouldn't be until after we graduated. So I saw this happening in the early 80s. Identity, group identity politics, reframing everything based on race, reframing everything based on alleged systemic problems that cannot be overcome. And like most people, I didn't pay a lot of attention to it. I went off into law and for a variety of reasons decided to join Cornell in the very end of 2007. And I knew nothing about any of this, just like most of the rest of the world. But over those ensuing 20 to 25 years, more and more faculty were adopting this. This critical legal theory became critical race theory, became a whole variety of other things that it's called. But the one distinguishing feature that I certainly noticed in Cornell when I started was a heavy focus on race, almost an obsession with seeing racism everywhere and using that as an explanation for everything that goes on in society. Now, it's gotten a lot worse over the next 12, 15 years since I started, but you can see that. So from this infancy, it grew over 20, 30 years. And that's one of the points I want to make is this did not happen overnight and it can't be changed overnight. Another thing that happened in this time period, just like at Hamilton Kirkland, is a growing imbalance in faculty political viewpoints. I've seen a study, I think it came out last fall, where if you went back only about 30 years, the split between faculty who self-identified as liberal versus conservative was only about 60-40. And right now, it's something like 28-1. And if you look at the younger faculty being hired, it's something like 40-1. So you have these theories being developed. You have a faculty only hiring people who agree with them, faculty adopting these viewpoints. And it almost all came to a head in the summer of 2020. Nothing that happened after George Floyd's death was invented. This was all there, all the theories, all the approaches to society, all the focus on racial groups was all there. And that was the spark, if you want to call it that, that allowed a lot of things to move forward that maybe administrators and faculty and students wouldn't have been emboldened to do before. The infrastructure was in place. And in really the summer of 2020, everybody is saying, because we get a lot of feedback on the website, where did this come from? It's every place now. Well, it's always been there. It just was emboldened to move forward. Various terms are used. The one that became very popular in the summer of 2020 is the term anti-racism, which is a term most famously associated with Ibram Kendi in his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. And anti-racism does not mean what we would logically think it means, that you are against racism. What it means is that you have to be an activist and that you have to focus on race. And his most famous motto, his most famous line is current discrimination is justified to remedy past discrimination, and future discrimination is justified to remedy current discrimination. So it's very much an approach that focuses on activism. You are either anti-racist or you are racist. You are either an activist at your school or you are a racist. So it creates this artificial divide. And in late July 2020, Cornell University president came forward with a program to turn us into an anti-racist campus, an anti-racism initiative. And in fact, that summer, the Kendi book was assigned as voluntary, as suggested reading for book discussions over the summer, and in the fall, that faculty would lead. So this was the recommended book. Now, while I was aware of critical race theory, I'd always been aware of it, while I was aware of a lot of what was going on, I'd never read Kendi's book. So that summer, it was offered free to people at Cornell. You logged in and you could read it online. And I ended up actually buying a used copy of it so I didn't rack up new book sales. And it was actually quite astounding and it was quite frightening. And it's very much what that teacher in Providence Middle School was experiencing. It's very much setting races against each other. It's very much shaming people based on their race. It's very much ascribing historical responsibility to people based on their race, and both victimhood and perpetrator, and it puts special obligations on people. And that has had a profoundly negative impact that I've seen, but it is very typical. And what we've done at criticalrace.org, that summer, I read Kendi's book and I said, oh my goodness, this is really terrible. So I started to do a little research. We had other people who worked for us who were able to do research. And at first I was going to write an op-ed And then I said, no, maybe a longer article. And as we began to accumulate the research on how widespread this was, how it wasn't an aberration at Cornell, we decided to create criticalrace.org. And we're now up to over 500 colleges and universities where we don't ascribe any value judgments to what they're doing. We simply document in a database what they're doing. We have people who go to their websites and go to other sources, and we just document it, and the database is the database. And it is truly astounding how deeply this highly racialized view of the world, highly racialized view of academics, highly racialized view of mandatory activism and mandatory training has become. It's not every place, and it's called different things at different places, but it's almost everywhere. We ended up also creating a database of top medical schools, which we're in the process of expanding. I would say, it may shock some of you, that the situation is actually in many ways worse in medical schools than it is in higher ed generally. And we've begun to document that. We've covered the top 50 medical schools so far, top 50 rated medical schools. And it's often called DEI or anti-racism, but whatever it is, it's the concepts of critical race theory that are deeply embedded in the American Medical Association, various accrediting entities, both at the law school level. The ABA is all on board with that. The ABA is now, for law schools, American Bar Association, going to require the study of racism in order to graduate. So it's really everywhere, and it's really truly astounding. We've also covered some of K through 12, although that's a much bigger sort of topic to cover. But throughout this, the one thing that really shocks me and shocks a lot of people is how well funded these efforts are. There are literally billions of dollars flowing into the space. And it's not just, in some ways, the faculty is the least of the problem. It's entrenched DEI bureaucracies at every level. It's the book companies. The book companies saw a market for this and they push the stuff. It's the consultants who get paid for this. It is literally everywhere, and it can sometimes seem very overwhelming. The absolute obsession with race that has taken over higher ed and now increasingly K through 12 and the professional schools. And it's an extreme negative. I can't think of a single good thing that has been accomplished on the campuses from this obsession with race. I think everybody in this room is against racism. We want people to be treated equally. We want equal opportunity. What's going on in campuses is the opposite of that. It is stratifying people. It is teaching people that they can't speak up for fear of being called racist, which can end your career. The false accusation can end your career, and people are bullied into silence. But it is everywhere. Major foundations are funding this. I saw a figure that post George Floyd, in the 2 years, not quite 2 years post George Floyd, major philanthropic entities contributed $2 billion to these efforts. And I've seen much larger numbers if you include corporations, the amount of resources they devote to it. So we're in this situation where academia has been captured. There is really no alternative viewpoint presented on campus. There is an effort to purge dissidents from campus. Anybody who speaks out against this is very likely to be targeted. I've gone through it. The summer of 2020, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, which now I think has broadened their scope as of 2 or 3 weeks ago, but the FIRE has documented the explosion of cases of professors being canceled starting in the summer of 2020 for speaking out against what's going on. And that's the situation. It's probably not something you haven't heard before, but as someone who has experienced it in his lived experience, I can tell you it is every bit as entrenched and deep and well-funded as you could have imagined in your worst imagination. And that leads me to what can be done about it. And there's no easy answers. I don't come here pretending to have a magic wand that can be waved and here's what you do and it ends. I think it's a lot of different things. The first thing I think that needs to be done, and really that has been the major accomplishment of the last year or so, maybe 18 months, depending how you want it, when you want to start counting, is to shine a light on it, to expose what is going on. Because most people in the United States are not supportive of this once they learn of it. And that's one thing we saw in Virginia. That's one thing we're seeing elsewhere. We're seeing that when people find out what's going on with this anti-racism, that misnamed anti-racism initiative, which frankly is demeaning to non-white students, because you're teaching them they're born victims, which we know is not true. You're teaching them they have no future in life because of their skin color, which we know is not true and is against everything we stand for. That when people find out about it, there is pushback. And what frightens the people who are advocating this, who are funding this, is that that pushback is multiracial, multi-ethnic, and cuts across party lines. I've seen it in the town where we are based in Rhode Island, Barrington, Rhode Island, and we've seen it elsewhere, that this is not, and we should never allow them to portray this as a Black versus white issue. This is an issue of what's in the best interest of the students. This is an issue of parents' rights and parents' ability to know what's going on. And this is an issue of actual negativity that is being forced on, in many cases, young children. So shine a light on it. The Martin Center does that. We do that. There's a lot of groups doing that. And the public consciousness, I think, has been raised, but it's got to continue, because these efforts often, once exposed, morph into different terminology. You probably have heard how we get into this endless circle of argument. Well, is it critical race theory? Is it not critical race theory? And that's really a way to sidetrack things. If you're obsessively focused on race, if you're saying all the things that I just said are told to children, it is at least the concepts of critical race theory. But if you shine a light on it, it may call itself anti-racism. It may call itself diversity, equity, and inclusion. It may call itself social emotional learning. Where there is money, there will be people who can find a way to make that money, and they are not going to give this up. So keep shining a light on it. And so that's first conclusion I have as to what we can do. But of course, that's not enough. Then the question becomes, particularly with regard to higher ed, how can higher ed be reformed? And the second conclusion that I come to is that higher ed cannot reform itself. It is too deeply penetrated. It is too emotionally and financially and career invested in these sort of programs. Higher ed cannot reform itself. There are bureaucracies where their jobs are devoted, are dependent upon pursuing these sort of ideologies, and they're not just going to give up their jobs and go away. There is, at many universities, a requirement that you adopt these ideologies. I didn't realize it until maybe a year ago, maybe less, but 2, 3, 4 years ago, Cornell adopted a policy that any new hire or any attempt to advance academically in your career requires a diversity, equity, and inclusion statement. And that's becoming more and more common. So they essentially have a screening mechanism to make sure that people who get hired and people who advance, people who get tenure, agree with them ideologically. And so I don't think higher ed can reform itself. Now, that's not to say that improvements can't be made. And there are groups supporting free speech on campuses. I'm absolutely all for those. A group was recently started at Cornell, and Jenna has been very helpful in that regard. And there are groups at other campuses, and that's all good stuff. I'm not saying don't do it. I'm saying do that. But the higher ed bureaucracies, the administrators, who in some ways are worse than the faculty, are not going to change. And so do those things, try to reform higher education, but I don't have any hope that that can be successful. So I think there's going to have to be pressure from outside. Now, what is that pressure going to look like? And will we do to them what they have done to us? And I don't advocate that. One of the things that has happened over these years is the concept of academic freedom has been weaponized by radical faculty and radical administrators to essentially eliminate academic freedom. And I don't think we should fall into that trap. So outside pressure is going to be important. That pressure can come from several sources. One source, and probably the best private outside source, are alumni. Alumni need to make themselves heard. There are alumni groups that are popping up around the country, and they need to make their voices heard. They have as much stake in this university as people who live on campus or teach on campus. Alumni, certainly if you listen to the administrators and the development people, they want alumni to be part of the campus and to feel part of the campus. And that's something that alumni need to make their voices heard. And so do donors. I don't think donor pressure is actually going to do a lot, because there's no indication, even with what's going on and what's been exposed, that donations to higher ed are declining, particularly to elite schools which now have become essentially, in many ways, credential factories, that you need the credential and therefore you will do whatever it takes to get your child into that school or to support that school because of the credentialism. But pressure from alums, and what should the pressure be? The pressure should not be fire somebody. That's not the pressure. Pressure should not be ban something. The pressure should be open up the campus. The pressure should be create a campus atmosphere where alternative views can be heard without people being mobbed, without people being targeted. Create that culture of respect that does not exist on many campuses. I think survey after survey has shown students are afraid to speak out. In fact, liberal students are afraid to speak out. There was a letter written to the Cornell Sun, which is the student newspaper, which said by self-identified liberal students, saying how toxic the campus atmosphere is because of the far left, quote unquote, progressive activists on campus who attack people fairly viciously. And if you want to understand students, you've got to understand that social media pressure, that peer pressure, is probably the single biggest thing that affects them. And so this is affecting everybody. So I want alums to try to use their resources and use their voices to create a better atmosphere on campuses. That's not going to solve the problem in its entirety, but it's something that's worthy. Then we get to the question of public pressure from public entities, which obviously is more important for public universities and public higher ed, that you don't have to fund everything and you have a say in what the public funds. And that's true even at private universities that receive federal and government funding. There was a very famous case involving the Solomon Amendment. So there was a time when law schools and various schools refused to allow the military to recruit on campuses. And a law was passed by Congress that threatened to withdraw funding from any university that did not treat military recruiters on an equal basis with other employer recruiters. And Harvard Law School, so here's my lived experience again. Harvard Law School was in the lead of this because of the Defense of Marriage Act and the because of the don't ask, don't tell policy at the time in the military, refused to allow the military to recruit for their JAG programs at Harvard Law School. And a law was passed called the Solomon Amendment that said we're going to revoke funding for any university that does that. And Harvard challenged that in court and ended up losing. I believe it went to the US Supreme Court, and the US Supreme Court said that you don't have to take the federal money, but if you take federal money, the federal government can put reasonable conditions on that. And the condition there was that you treat military recruiters on an equal basis with other recruiters. And the interesting thing was that Harvard Law School was doing this, not Harvard University, but the funding was going to be pulled from Harvard University. I don't know what the total federal funding at that time to Harvard University was, but it probably was in the tens of millions a year, maybe higher than that. And when faced with that court loss and when faced with the loss of federal funding, Harvard Law School relented and agreed and backed down. And so funding, obviously you've got to be in power politically, but funding is a very powerful tool. And if done for the right purposes and with reasonable conditions, there is no reason why you have to fund programs that discriminate against people on the basis of race, that belittle people on the basis of race, that do not treat people equally. And I think that's going to be a big future area. And to do that, you don't need to pass new anti-discrimination laws. I think a lot of what happens on campuses actually violates existing anti-discrimination laws. It's just that nobody's conditioning, or at least nobody's enforcing conditions on compliance for that. So outside pressure is needed, private pressure, public pressure. The fourth conclusion that I have is I think we need to figure out a way to provide alternatives. And I'm a big fan, I've mentioned them earlier in this lecture, of the Alexander Hamilton Institute for the Study of Western Civilization. They were formed by senior, now emeritus, professors at Hamilton College who were upset that the study of Western civilization literally had been removed from the curriculum. And so they got 100% funding to build this center on campus. And it wouldn't have cost Hamilton College a penny. The building was going to be paid for. The faculty salaries were going to be covered by an endowment. The president of the university, of the college, approved it. The faculty threw an absolute fit and the administration backed down. And they ended up building the building, or they ended up building the center outside, off of campus. And I don't know what their numbers are now, but at one point, 10 to 15% of the student body was attending their non-credit academic curriculum, their academic lectures, et cetera, which is pretty significant. So there is a yearning for this sort of learning from students, but it's not being provided on campus in most places. So I think I really like that model. Alternatives have to be provided for students, because students, if they're willing to speak up, at least the ones who speak up to me behind closed doors, there's a lot of discontent about what's happening on campuses. And if there was an alternative, I think that would be welcomed by many students. And my ultimate conclusion is, and then we'll get to questions and answers, is that there is no one answer to this. There is no one remedy. It is all of the above, but it's worth fighting for. The universities are not going away. Sometimes I'll have people say, well, I'm going to stop donating to Cornell. And I never advocate that. All I say is that use your donation to try and improve the campus rather than to just throw it in there and hope it gets used for good use. You know, get involved, talk to people, find out how your donations are being used. You have that right. But one thing that's not going to happen is you withholding your donation isn't going to change anything at Cornell. And that's where I come out. All of the above, it's worth fighting for. It is intricately attached to the survival of our country.
Thank you, Professor Jacobson. So I think what we're going to do for Q&A is I'll have members of the audience ask a question, and I will repeat it so that Professor Jacobson can hear it if he can't hear when you say it. So are there any questions? The question was, critical race theory has Marxist roots, but no one seems to be talking about it from that angle. Why are we not calling it out as a Marxist theory and that its proponents are Marxists?
Well, I think it is true that those are the roots of it. And I think it's certainly also true that a lot of the rhetoric is anti-capitalist. It's wrapped up in this whole concept of, oppression. And so I think people do talk about it, but I think there's probably a reticence to use the M word with regard to it, because it would be a way to deflect the conversation. The issue is not, or at least I would argue, the issue is how it has morphed over time into the substitution of race and ethnicity for class struggle. So I think it's worth talking about. I think it's worth explaining, but I think probably the reason people don't do more of it is now you're starting a whole different conversation But I agree with you. I mean, people, I think, need to understand that what has happened is class struggle has now been replaced by racial struggle, and the similarities are overwhelming.
Okay, so this was a long question. It's gonna test my memory. So the first part is that it's a former professor at Duke University, just underlining your point that critical race theory, anti-racism, all of these movements have done just what you say. This is a professor at Duke who says you are not exaggerating. He has experienced all the same things that you have, although I don't think nobody's tried to cancel you yet, right, John?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. People even tried to cancel him. So he's experienced all the same things. The second part of the question his comments were about the Marxist roots of critical race theory, and that all of everyone involved in Marxism and this hate individualism. And the point being that you can always find groups to divide people in. And so the point of it, whether it's Marxist or CRT, is to divide people into groups, find disparities, which you will find no matter how you divide people, and just keep using that division. How'd I do, John? Okay, so that's the comment.
Yes, I mean, and like I mentioned, I've witnessed over this time period, over multiple decades, the growing concept of group identity, group political rights, as opposed to the individual. And I think that one thing that needs to be done, it'll be tough, is to refocus a lot of the discussions about individual rights, but that has been downplayed and that has been denigrated. But if you treat everybody with respect and you give everybody an equal opportunity, I think a lot of these problems would be solved. When you get into group dynamics, then you're just putting people into a box. So I agree that this whole concept of group identity and group rights has been a huge negative.